Imagine waking up to breaking US news that a single financial decision in Europe could trigger something Russia says is close to an act of war. Not missiles, not military escalation, just money, frozen Russian money, locked inside Western banks since the invasion of Ukraine. Now, European leaders want to unlock over $105 billion from those frozen assets to help Ukraine keep fighting and keep its economy alive. But Moscow says if Europe goes through with it, the fallout could be explosive, legally, politically, and maybe even militarily. Tonight, we're diving into what Russia just threatened, why Europe is pushing ahead anyway, how the U.S. is involved behind the scenes, and what this all means for the U.S. economy, global markets, and everyday Americans watching from home. Stay with me, because the next few minutes could reshape how you see the Ukraine war, U.S. foreign policy, and the global balance of power. Let's break down exactly what happened and why this story is blowing up worldwide. Russia's Security Council just issued one of its sharpest warnings in months. Dmitry Medvedev, one of Putin's closest allies, said that if the European Union moves forward with a new plan to use frozen Russian assets, it could be considered a casus belli. That's a Latin phrase meaning an act that justifies war. This isn't subtle language. This is Russia saying, touch our frozen money, and we might treat it like an attack. So what is Europe planning? Over the past 2 years, Europe froze a massive chunk of Russia's central bank assets, money Russia had parked in European institutions before the invasion of Ukraine. Most of it is held by Euroclear, a huge financial clearinghouse based in Belgium. Now the European Commission wants to unlock around euros 90 billion, roughly $105 billion, and send it to Ukraine as part of a long-term support plan. Ukraine desperately needs funding to cover its enormous budget gap over the next several years. And Europe says Russia caused the war. So Russia's frozen money should help pay for it. But here's where things get complicated. Some European countries are all in. Others are terrified. Countries like Belgium are nervous about what happens legally after the war ends. If Russia sues or retaliates financially, who gets stuck with the bill? The country that hosted the money, or all EU members? Meanwhile, Hungary is blocking unanimous decisions on new financial aid for Ukraine, which is why the EU is exploring this reparations loan idea as a workaround. Behind the scenes, US officials are pushing for a broader peace deal that brings Russia and Ukraine closer to negotiations. Ukraine's security chief is meeting the US special envoy in Miami, while France is leaning on China to pressure Russia. But as of today, nothing is resolved, and negotiations haven't produced a real breakthrough. One former British ambassador to the U.S. said something pretty shocking this week. He believes the war may drag on through the winter and possibly much longer. Unless Ukraine makes concessions that he says are politically impossible, things like giving up territory or promising never to join NATO. And he added that if former President Trump can't secure a peace deal, he might simply step back and tell Europe, this is your problem now. That would shift enormous responsibility to European countries, some of which are already struggling with the financial and military pressure. But right now, the real flashpoint, the most dangerous part of this entire story, is Europe's plan to use Russia's frozen assets. Because money might end up being the trigger point that escalates tensions faster than any battlefield development. Now let's talk about why this story isn't just a European problem. Why it matters directly to Americans, our economy, and our political future. Here's the truth. When huge global powers like the EU and Russia start arguing about frozen money, one side says it could be grounds for war. It affects every major financial market, including the US. Why? Because the world runs on confidence. Global markets stay stable only when big nations follow predictable rules. If Europe suddenly redirects $105 billion in Russian central bank assets, even legally, Russia may look at that as theft. European courts may treat it differently. US allies might see it as necessary. China might view it as a dangerous precedent, and investors everywhere could see it as a sign that geopolitical risks are getting worse. That means volatility. And volatility affects U.S. interest rates, inflation expectations, energy prices, the strength of the dollar, and global investment flows, not to mention. The US is deeply tied to Europe economically. When Europe shakes, Wall Street feels it. And when the war in Ukraine becomes more uncertain, American taxpayers end up involved too, whether through military support, humanitarian aid, or higher prices for things like oil, fuel, or global commodities. There's also a political angle Americans can't ignore. As debates continue over US foreign spending, Europe's struggle to fund Ukraine puts pressure on the US government to choose a direction. Lead, step back, or push Europe to take full responsibility. That decision affects American voters, especially in an election cycle. Here's another piece a lot of people overlook. If Russia uses this financial fight as a justification to escalate, even symbolically, global markets could react instantly. Investors hate instability. A single statement from Moscow can move prices. And if Europe follows through with this plan, and Russia retaliates economically or politically, the US could end up in the crossfire of a global financial tug-of-war. This isn't a distant conflict. It's something that could hit the US economy, the stock market, and everyday Americans in ways most people won't see coming. So now, let's look ahead. What happens if Europe actually decides to unlock the $15 billion in frozen Russian assets? There are three major scenarios experts are watching, and each one has big implications for global markets, U.S. foreign policy, and the future of the Ukraine war. Small blue diamond scenario 1. Europe pushes forward, and Russia retaliates politically. This is one of the most likely outcomes. If the EU approves the plan using a qualified majority, they can bypass Hungary's veto. Russia has already signaled this would be seen as a hostile act, not necessarily direct war, but a major escalation. Retaliation could include cutting remaining ties with European institutions, seizing European-owned assets inside Russia, increasing cyber attacks, limiting cooperation on energy or trade, stepping up influence with China or Iran for Europe. This would increase economic pressure for the U.S. It shifts even more global instability onto American markets and pushes Washington to decide whether to stay deeply involved or step aside. Small blue diamond scenario 2. Europe moves slowly, waiting for U.S. direction in this scenario. The EU delays the use of the assets. They continue funding Ukraine with profits from the frozen money, but avoid touching the principal. This would buy time, especially as the U.S. works toward possible negotiations. Behind closed doors, Washington is exploring different peace frameworks. These include conversations in Miami with Ukraine's national security chief and diplomatic outreach involving China if a peace plan starts forming. Europe might hold off on the $105 billion until after a settlement. This would reduce the risk of triggering a Russian retaliation. But the downside is obvious. Ukraine needs money now. Delays make it harder for Kyiv to keep its government running and its military supplied. Small blue diamond scenario 3. A major diplomatic shift. US, Europe, and China find middle ground. This is the least likely, but the most impactful scenario. If the US envoy, the French president, and Chinese leadership all push toward coordinated negotiations, there could be a breakthrough. Russia might soften its tone temporarily, and Europe could postpone any use of frozen assets until an agreement is reached. The challenge? Russia wants Ukrainian concessions. Ukraine cannot accept. Ukraine wants guarantees Russia refuses to offer. And the U.S. is split politically on how much involvement it wants moving forward. Still, if diplomacy intensifies, markets would stabilize, the U.S. dollar would cool off, and the global economy would see relief. So what's the most likely path? Based on current expert sentiment, Europe will move ahead with the plan, slowly, carefully, and in stages, while trying to avoid a point of no return with Moscow. Russia will keep issuing threats. Diplomats will keep negotiating. The war will continue through winter, and global markets will stay alert for any sudden escalation. For Americans watching from home, this means keeping an eye on U.S. inflation, gas prices, U.S. stock market volatility, political debates about foreign aid, the stability of the global economy. This is one of those global stories that feels far away until it lands right on your doorstep. Europe is preparing to unlock over $105 billion in frozen Russian money to help keep Ukraine afloat. Moscow says this move could be treated as a justification for war. The U.S. is working behind the scenes to guide negotiations. But progress has been slow, and the global financial system is bracing for whatever comes next. For Americans, this isn't just an overseas conflict. This affects our economy, our markets, our gas prices, and our political decisions, possibly more than most people realize. As this story evolves, we'll keep tracking every update that affects the U.S. economy, global markets, and America's national security. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure you stick with this channel, because we bring you the real context behind the biggest geopolitical stories shaping the world today. Backhand index pointing right before you go, tap the like button. It really helps the channel grow. Backhand index pointing right and hit subscribe so you never miss a major U.S. economy news update. Thanks for watching and stay safe. I'll see you in the next report.